Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, August 22nd, 2025, and our friend Ambassador Chas Freeman is back with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you, Nima.
Let me start, Ambassador, with the meetings, two meetings between the Trump administration, or let's say the United States and Russia, and then the United States together with United States with Europeans together with Zelensky. Did you find the contrast, or if there was some, between the two meetings?
Well, the two meetings were very different. Obviously, the meeting in Anchorage was one between sovereign equals. Vladimir Putin was greeted as such. Many people in the West have complained that this restored to him the dignity he had lost. Um, whoops, excuse me.
No problem, Ambassador. That happens.
No, that is nonsense. Anyway, this is somebody trying to sell me something. Anyway,
It happens all the time here in Brazil.
so I'm sorry about that. Anyway, the meeting was between equals in Anchorage. Many people in the West have complained about Donald Trump recognizing Vladimir Putin as an equal. The meeting in the White House with the 7 European leaders was really quite the opposite. It was a group of vassal states meeting with their great leader. Something right out of the era of the Soviet Union with its Eastern European satellite states. And many have noted that. It was a signal that Europeans want very much to have the United States remain their protector in Europe. They want to keep fighting this war. They want the United States to be with them as they do that. They have no interest in making peace with Russia. What they talked about was security guarantees, and they did those discussions. They framed that purely in military terms, which are utterly unacceptable to the Russians. In effect, they seem to have learned nothing from the outbreak of the war in 2022, when Russia showed that it was willing to go to war to prevent the presence of hostile forces in Ukraine and the perpetuation of a hostile relationship between Ukraine and it. It was these are very different meetings. What they had in common was a lot of people talking very vaguely, no real agreements on anything, people talking past each other. And we see this with what has happened since then.
I think the main question would be, what was the main goal of that meeting? They wanted to understand what is the Russian position. They wanted to make a bigger deal, a grand strategy considering Russia. What was that all about?
Well, I think the meeting, if you're speaking of the meeting between Trump and Putin, it was a very complicated maneuver. On the one hand, Trump does want to get out of this war. He has very cleverly handed off responsibility for the war to the Europeans. So if there are American weapons that reach Ukraine, they will come from the Europeans who pay for them. So now Mr. Trump can claim, look, I didn't stop the flow of weapons. Ukraine lost the war, not my fault. I didn't do anything. I didn't stop the intelligence cooperation. I didn't stop providing weapons, but the Europeans failed to stop the Russians on the battlefield in Ukraine. So he has created the conditions for domestic avoidance of any blame for what is actually happening, which is Ukraine losing the war. Now, that's part of it. The second part of it is that he really does want to find an out, but he has a very quaint American idea, which is that you can settle things at the top, that personalities can outweigh national interests. And therefore, he thinks, well, if I can meet with Vladimir Putin, we can settle things between us. He didn't make any preparation to do that. And of course, that is not the case. There are serious issues at stake that require careful negotiation. No such preparation took place for that summit. The same problem now affects the proposed meeting between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. It is true, Trump did persuade Vladimir Putin, who had not been willing to meet with Zelensky, that he should. And he also has put Zelensky on the spot to meet with Putin. So at some point they will meet. But it's obvious that they cannot meet without a lot of preparation for the meeting. And so we've heard Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, make it clear that there can be no meeting at that level between Zelensky and Putin until the framework for the meeting and the basic parameters for an agreement have been worked out. That is normal diplomatic practice. The fact that it seems to come as a surprise to many people just shows how much we have forgotten about how to do diplomacy.
Do you feel that Donald Trump and his team understand the position of Russians? Because as you mentioned, I think you're mentioning the interview Lavrov had on NBC News, and he was somehow he just simply describing the obvious things that the Russians were talking about the whole
Right.
in the last 3 years they were talking about it. But how about the understanding on the part of the Trump administration?
Well, the only person who counts apparently in the Trump administration is Donald Trump. He doesn't have any real staff helping him. He has a cabinet and principal assistants who are afraid to say anything to him that he doesn't want to hear. So I would say, however, this was an important meeting in that he now has a better, if still imperfect, understanding of the Russian position. He understands that talking about a ceasefire in the absence of a framework for a ceasefire that leads to peace makes no sense and will not happen. And therefore, he changed his position from demanding a ceasefire to talking about the need for a comprehensive peace. He clearly does not understand the issue of security guarantees. And here I want to make a point. Before you talk about security guarantees, you should define what it is you're guaranteeing. The Russians are perfectly willing to guarantee the neutrality and independence of Ukraine. They are not willing to guarantee the continued hostility of Ukraine to themselves or the presence on Ukrainian soil of foreign troops from an alliance against them. So if the question is, and a further point is, security guarantees must also include Russia, because this war began because the Russians felt threatened by the proposed expansion of NATO to Ukraine and the fact that for 8 years, the West, NATO, had been training Ukrainians to fight Russia. And in fact, on the eve of the war, I'm not talking about the civil war in Ukraine, but the Russian invasion, on the eve of the Russian invasion, Ukrainian forces were massed against the Russian-speaking republics that had emerged in the Donbass after Ukraine insisted on banning the use of the Russian language for official purposes or for education. So he understood that there have to be security guarantees, but I don't think he understood what they mean and who has to give them and who has to receive them. So what we're talking about here, I think, in the Russian mind at least, is something like the 1955 Austrian State Treaty, in which the rights of minorities in Austria were guaranteed. Austria became an independent state, and everyone, the four parties who agreed to the treaty, that is the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France, all understood that Austria would be neutral and guaranteed that neutrality. What Russia is looking for is a guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality and independence, as well as the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. I don't think there has been any change in the Russian position since December 2021, or perhaps June 2024, when they outlined their position. Whether Mr. Trump understands all of this or not is an open question. It appears that he understands some of it now, whereas he didn't understand any of it earlier.
Here is what Donald Trump posted, Ambassador. It says that it's very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country. It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defense, but it's not allowed to play offensive. There is no chance of winning. It is like that with Ukraine and Russia. Crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden wouldn't let Ukraine fight back. Only defend, defend. I think everybody's confused when this sort of hypocrisy, I don't know if we can call it hypocrisy, is somehow he's trying to play a game with Russians the way that he's talking. What's your understanding of that?
He's playing a game with the American public. He knows Ukraine is losing the war. He wants to blame that on Biden, not himself. As I said earlier, that's what this business of shoving off responsibility on the Europeans is about. He's evading responsibility for something that is going to happen on his watch. That is a very typical Trump maneuver. And we've seen that when he cannot accomplish something, he tries to create the illusion of having accomplished it. That is what is happening here. He's trying to create the illusion of making peace. He has, however, opened the door to a peace process, but it's clear that it's going to take quite a bit of time for that door to be truly pushed open. As Sergei Lavrov said, there can be no meeting between Putin and Zelensky until the ground has been prepared for such a meeting so that it can accomplish something. There's no point in putting the two of them in the boxing ring, as Trump seems to imagine, and letting them slug each other. That's no improvement on what's happening on the battlefield. So in the absence of diplomacy, in the absence of careful preparation for summit meetings and negotiations between the parties here, there won't be any peace. And if there is no peace, Russia will continue advancing. The Ukrainian defenses are crumbling as we speak. The outlook for Ukraine is dire. If we were really concerned about Ukraine, we would be responding to the 69% of Ukrainians who now believe there has to be a negotiated peace. We would not be urging, as the Europeans are doing, the Ukrainians to fight to the last Ukrainian. We're almost down to the last Ukrainian. I don't know if you saw, but there was a Russian hack of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which appeared to reveal that Ukrainian casualties, meaning killed in action or deserted from the army, total 1.7 million people. When you look at the numbers, your first reaction is, this can't be true. But when you do the math, it's very plausible. And the materials from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry look authentic. So Ukraine has sacrificed a huge amount of life and people in order to serve the Western purpose of weakening and isolating Russia. And that there's very little evidence that the West has cared at all about the Ukrainians in this process. It has used them. So it's time to call this off. Mr. Trump, to his credit, seems to recognize that. But he wants to treat it like a real estate transaction. Let me trade my skyscraper for your skyscraper. And you can throw in a bus station too while you're at it. This is not how international relationships work. And furthermore, they don't work like sporting events. Sporting events have rules. They have umpires. This is no holds barred. So Mr. Trump he has a dilemma. He is in a bit of a pickle. He can't accomplish what he wants with the staff and the approach that he takes. But he has, to his credit, opened the door for something to happen if we have the people. Here I want to note also that there was a very eloquent letter from former Deputy Secretary of State, former head of the CIA, Bill Burns, to discarded civil servants, people whose expertise is desperately needed, but who are no longer in the government as a result of the ridiculous rampages of Doge and the absurd cuts in workforces that the Trump administration has made. There's not a single Russian expert on the National Security Council staff, apparently. Those at the State Department appear to have left. So the United States is deliberately flinging away the very expertise that made us an effective great power. And Mr. Trump is left to deal with all this on his own.
It's so amazing to see Marco Rubio being the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor doing none of them.
No, he does none of those jobs. He seems to be focused on intimidating Venezuela now with armada of Aegis-class cruisers and 4,000 soldiers and so forth and so on. It's the same old regime change approach to Venezuela that has consistently failed for decades. If the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and expect different results, this is it.
It feels, Ambassador, that Donald Trump, deep down, he believes that let's assume Europeans want to continue the conflict. They're not going to do that. They're not going to send their troops to Ukraine. He really believes that, because the way that he's talking to European, it seems to me like that.
I think he's trying to jolly the Europeans along. He basically said to them, look, what he did in Anchorage was basically say to the Europeans, I don't want this war, but if you want it, go ahead. You be my guest. I'll even sell you weapons with which to conduct the war, but we're not going to be in it. And now he's saying, well, maybe we could do some kind of no-fly zone overflight of Ukraine in support of something or other. But the fact is, it's absolutely clear the Russians will not permit NATO troops in Ukraine. And they have spent 3.5 years proving that. So this is all nonsense, and it is a product of the West inhaling its own propaganda. You're still seeing people say Ukraine can win. How? How can Ukraine win? Does it have the manpower to win? It doesn't. Ukraine has had plenty of weapons. It has been very brave on the battlefield. It has been very inventive and innovative. You have to admire the Ukrainians for their bravery and their adaptability to new warfare conditions. They have risen to the occasion. But even if you don't accept those leaked figures from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, they have paid a horrible price in terms of the number of men and women who have died in this fight.
Ambassador, it seems somehow when you look at the conflict in Ukraine and the way that Europeans, they were so desperate after the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I don't know what was the reason. And do they really feel that the United States wants to leave Europe and let them alone with their problems?
I think they do fear that. In effect, as you and I have discussed before, for 80 years, they've had to make no decisions. They had a protector. They didn't have to spend much on defense. Of course, they do spend a fair amount on defense. But the fact is that they didn't face any real danger on their own. They don't face any danger on their own now either. I mean, there's absolutely no indication that the Russians either want to or could advance beyond Ukraine. And I don't think the Russians want to take back the 3 Baltic states. So, this positing some kind of existential threat from Russia to Western Europe is not very persuasive, to say the least. In fact, it's quite ridiculous. On the other hand, from the Russian perspective, a NATO presence in Ukraine, whether it's with Ukraine as part of NATO or almost part of NATO, but not quite, something like what was being prepared between 2014 and 2022, a huge NATO armed and trained army aimed at Russia. This is existential for the Russians, which is why they went to war. So there's an asymmetry here in terms of what I call the balance of fervor. Fervor is the intensity with which you are committed to a cause. The balance of fervor is why a small man can beat up a big man in a bar if the big man makes a pass at the small man's wife, because he cares more about the outcome. He's willing to take more punishment. It is why North Vietnam succeeded in Vietnam. It is why the Taliban succeeded in Afghanistan. So war is not a balance of technology, decided by who has the better aircraft or the better missiles or whatever. It's decided ultimately by human beings and how much they're willing to sacrifice to achieve results. The Russians have shown that they are deadly serious, and there is no point in putting forward proposals that are automatically going to be rejected by them and indeed sneered at by them, because they just show that you haven't studied their position, you haven't listened to them, you haven't thought realistically about what is happening, you are self-deluded, and you are not going to produce the results that you want. You want to get realistic results, you have to be realistic. So what is happening is a lot of brave talk in Western Europe by people who've managed to psych themselves up to be afraid of Russia, and who are desperate to keep the United States in Europe to handle Russia. But the United States is not necessary to handle Russia. What is necessary is a peace in which Russia does not feel threatened and therefore has no excuse for taking action, and in which Western Europeans do not feel threatened, and in which the position of Ukraine as an independent, neutral state, like Austria, or for that matter, Switzerland. Switzerland was guaranteed in 1820 by Europeans as an independent, neutral state. Belgium was guaranteed diplomatically. Of course, the Germans violated that on 2 occasions. But still, the fact is, to think of security guarantees in purely military terms is to make a proposal that can't work. There has to be a political framework. So far, Europeans, and the United States for that matter, have come up with no plausible political framework. The Russians want to talk about that. And apparently, they claim Mr. Trump agreed that he would talk about it. Many people doubt that Vladimir Putin actually succeeded to that extent. But you can't get away from the main issues, which are removing the perceived threat from Ukraine to Russia, securing the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine or the areas of Ukraine not taken by Russia, presumably also securing the rights of Hungarian speakers, Romanian speakers, Polish speakers, Slovak speakers, and so on, and finding a way to fit a neutral buffer state called Ukraine into a broader European security architecture, just as Switzerland, Austria, Belgium have fit at various points into a European security architecture. Belgium, of course, is now part of NATO, no longer neutral, but that's how it began. It began as a neutral, independent state intended to be a buffer between the German states and the French.
The only reason, Ambassador, that comes to my mind in order to understand what's going on with the reality, with the mindset of Europeans, in order to understand this policy of the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine, is that they somehow believe that if let's the war continue, and if the Ukrainian army goes weaker, Russia would consider going to the western part of Ukraine, which would be a trap for the Russians. We don't see that coming from Russians. We don't see anybody in Russia talking about that. How do you feel about that? Do they really believe that they can convince Russia to go to the western part of Ukraine?
No, I think the Russians have a very relevant experience in the recent past, which is Afghanistan. They went into Afghanistan. Interestingly, if you read the accounts of their presence in Afghanistan, they were trying to do pretty much the same things that the West was trying to do when the West went into Afghanistan for 20 wasted years. That is, increase the rights of women, educate people, build infrastructure, modernize the economy, give Afghanistan a national government as opposed to the sort of coalition of ethnic groups that constitute Afghanistan. They failed, just as the United States and NATO failed in Afghanistan. But their failure was very consequential because it had a great deal to do with bringing down the Soviet Union. Now, they don't want to repeat that experience. They know very well how nasty, how hostile, how opposed to Russia people in Western Ukraine are. After all, Western Ukraine, which was given basically to Ukraine by Stalin at the end of World War II. We're talking about a state that was created by Lenin and which was expanded by Stalin. And we are talking about a state which has as its national hero Stepan Bandera, a fellow traveler, participant with the German SS, whose group in Western Ukraine was responsible for killing 150,000 Poles and 250,000 Jews. And so when the Russians talk about denazification, we may laugh at that, but we shouldn't. And there really is an issue of continuity with the German Nazi presence and people of like mind, fascists from the 1930s and 40s, who now basically control Volodymyr Zelensky. He ran on a peace campaign. He ran on a platform of peace, acceptance of the Minsk Accords, that is autonomy for the two Donbas oblasts within Ukraine. Within 6 weeks, he reversed himself on everything. Why? Because he was threatened. He could not withstand the pressure, both from Western Ukrainians and from MI6 and the United States, the CIA. So I don't think the Russians want anything to do with Western Ukraine. And I'd like to see some evidence that they do. I think there's still a lot of questions about what that column that was extended toward Kyiv was really all about, whether it was to take Kyiv, in which case the force was clearly inadequate, or whether it was a diversion to take the Ukrainian troops who were marshaled against the Donetsk and Lugansk, take them off that front and force them to redeploy and take the pressure off the Russian speakers in the east. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it's an open question. And I think it's high time that we dealt with this issue realistically rather than attributing objectives to the Russians. We should listen to what the Russians have said and are saying. And we will find, if we do, that they have been very, very consistent, even if we have been all over the map.
We had the foreign minister of China going to India talking with Modi, which Modi explained it as so positive, and the way that they're trying to solve the problems between the two nations. It's all about the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine, isn't it?
Well, it's about, in that case, President Trump very foolishly putting a 50% tariff on India in a hostile act, which was taken as such by the Indians. My first tour in the Foreign Service, in the diplomatic service of the United States, was in India. That was in the mid-late 1960s. Even then, we were trying to persuade the Indians to align themselves with us against the Soviet Union. The Indians have consistently demanded non-alignment. They do not want to be part of other people's quarrels, and they have not changed. But what has just changed is that the United States, which they thought was a friend, has revealed itself to be an opponent, if not an enemy. And therefore, you see all of the developments that we've seen. That is, India cutting closer to Russia, India trying to patch up its relations with China, from which it has a great deal to gain. And one of the most unnoticed but important developments in that relationship is an apparent agreement to demarcate the line of control in the Himalayas. The problems the two sides have had has been over disagreement about where that line is. It is a de facto border, but it's not one that they agree on. Now it looks like they're going to try to reach agreement on where the border is. That is a step toward ultimately solving this problem geopolitically. In the meantime, China has very clearly offered to India a level of economic cooperation that the United States is now withholding. So this is a geopolitically foolish move by the Trump administration. I don't think it will be easily repaired. I don't think the Indians will forget what the United States just threatened them with.
Yeah. I think we have to understand the position of India, because I don't know if you saw Scott Bessent talking about the importation of Russian oil from 1% to 41%. And India has a lot in this game, and they cannot ignore Russia. It's not impossible. It's somehow impossible for them to do that.
Well, no, they've had a long-standing strategic cooperation with Russia. They do need oil. The idea that the United States can, with the West, unilaterally embargo Russian oil is demonstrably false. I mean, there has been an embargo for the last 3.5 years, and all it's done is divert trade and produce a high level of smuggling and so forth. We also have the irony that the Chinese are actually a bigger importer of Russian oil than the Indians, and yet they are not subject to these punitive tariffs, which is really, from the Indian point of view, adding insult to injury. So I think Mr. Bessent shows an alarming lack of understanding of international trade and international relations when he talks the way he did. And I would note that, he's not the only one in the Trump cabinet with not much understanding of these things and a propensity for loose talk. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, basically told the Chinese we were only going to sell them inferior semiconductors for their AI. And as a result, the central government in China has said, well, we don't want your inferior semiconductors. This refers to the H20 by NVIDIA. These are graphical processing units, GPUs, which are essential for AI. But the Chinese are trying very hard to develop their own self-sufficiency in this regard, and we've just pushed them farther in that direction. You wonder what the point of this is.
I think the only option that the United States has, if somehow everything that they're trying to get something with Russia, but if that doesn't work, the only option they have is to go after India. Here is what the Trump's trade advisor Navaro said. He says that it's nonsense that India needs to buy Russian oil. The path to peace in Ukraine goes through New Delhi. India doesn't want to acknowledge its role in the conflict in Ukraine. Additional tariffs on India for buying Russian oil come into effect on August 27th. As you mentioned, it seems that China is so big for them to go after them, as J.D. Vance has mentioned last week. The only option they have is India, and the way that they're talking about India says if they want to sacrifice us because of the conflict in Ukraine, so why should we consider a better relationship with the United States?
Well, don't forget, you're sitting in Brazil, I believe, and your president and your country have been subjected to the same sort of bullying. In your case, about your internal affairs, the status of your judiciary, its scope for making decisions, the status of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who I understand is trying to defect to Argentina. So you can't explain these things rationally, and I don't think Peter Navaro has any credibility at all as a counselor on trade, even if he has that position. That is to say, the author of a book called Death by China, clearly has a political stance, but economically, his theories have not worked. There's no evidence they will. So the whole thing, his whole argument was, if you put on tariffs, people will rush to invest in the United States and industry will be rebuilt in the United States. Hasn't happened. So it isn't going to happen. And I would note also, today is Friday, August 22nd, as you mentioned, and Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Powell, gave a talk at Jackson Hole in Wyoming to an international gathering of central banks, and basically said, well, I want to leave the question of whether we're going to lower interest rates open, because there may not be any need to do that. Why? Because we have a combination of rising inflation and contracting labor market. That is the definition of stagflation. That is, he didn't use the word, but that is exactly what it is. Slower growth and faster inflation. And he said, well, basically the contracting labor market cancels out the inflation. Well, maybe it does in macroeconomic terms, but it doesn't for the average American who has to go to the supermarket or get a car repaired when prices are going up and jobs are fewer. So this is very interesting. So I wonder how Mr. Navaro explains that.
But since you mentioned Brazil and India, I think these are two countries which were somehow important, which are important for the United States foreign policy. But when it comes to the foreign policy, what does the word disaster mean? Because to what extent they can consider it, because we are reaching to a point that nobody would trust them in terms of the way that they're talking about Brazil, India, China is not a good actor, Russia is the enemy. In the Middle East, you don't see that's anything that helps the United States.
Well, don't forget that the Kingdom of Lesotho, which is a mountain kingdom surrounded entirely by the Orange Free State in South Africa, and has the world's only effective mountain cavalry on horseback, a wonderful small country, is subject to punitive tariffs. For what? Basically, Switzerland has been attacked by the Trump administration. Uh, you know, so is this rational? No, it is not rational. Does it? What are the consequences of it? The consequences are that the United States, which had a pretty good reputation internationally for being competent, for being serious, for keeping its word more or less, now has a reputation for being sloppy, imprecise, incompetent, and not keeping its word. So one day, President Trump says, well, we're going to put a huge tariff on, we're going to sanction Russia with 100% something or other. Then after Anchorage, he says, well, there's no point in that anymore. So one day he's on, one day he's off. Nobody can figure out what the tariff rate is because it's subject to change, like the barometric pressure, and you don't know what that's going to be. This is incompetent. And that is going back to the issue of Ukraine. That, to me, is the major obstacle to peace. I think there is a possibility of peace if we address the questions that are what Vladimir Putin calls the root issues, the root questions, intelligently. Can we come up with a political framework which would reduce the perceived threat to Russia from the West and reduce the perceived threat from Russia to the West? Can we go back to the neutrality that Ukraine professed at its independence, which is why, Moscow recognized Ukraine as an independent, neutral state. It was only when the neutrality became compromised by NATO and American ambition that these difficulties arose. When you start talking, as people did right after the 2014 coup in Kyiv, about seizing Sevastopol, the Russian naval base for the last 200 years in Crimea, for NATO, what are the Russians supposed to imagine is at stake? So we need to be realistic. We need to be imaginative. And I noticed one of the most telling remarks was by Chancellor Merz at that meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office, where the 7 Europeans sat there like school kids in front of a teacher. And he said, I cannot imagine there could be peace without there first being a ceasefire. To which my response is, you clearly have no imagination at all. And you should think a little bit about that. Why? If you're losing a war, of course you want a ceasefire. That's natural. You want to freeze things where they are before they get worse. Ukraine wants a ceasefire. Very sensible. I agree with that. Russia doesn't want a ceasefire because if there's no diplomacy, there has to be military action, and they're on the advance. They're on the offensive, and they're not going to accept a ceasefire unless it's part of a broader agreement on a long-term peace that removes what they perceive as an existential threat. And the irony in all this is that the United States started out after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the expansion of the Partnership for Peace throughout Europe by saying that we wanted a Europe that was whole and free. But in fact, our actions have divided Europe. And when people talk about Ukraine as a democracy, I think they should take a closer look. The press is all nationalized. All the political parties have been abolished. There are no elections. The Russian Orthodox Church is banned in favor of a fascist nationalized Ukrainian Orthodox Church. People are being rounded up and conscripted, press ganged into the army. We know that even if that figure of 1.7 million killed and wounded and deserted is from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is bogus, we know that a huge number of Ukrainians have sacrificed their lives for nothing so far. They have not got democracy. They have not cured corruption. We hear reports that the outflow of corrupt funds to other destinations like the UAE is accelerating because people suspect that maybe the current regime in Kyiv isn't going to last too much longer, and they want to get their money out while they still can. So this is an ugly, ugly picture. And the fact that the Chancellor of Germany believes that there has to be a ceasefire before these issues can be addressed is frankly very depressing.
Today we've learned, Ambassador, that Iran has closed off its Western airspace to test ballistic missiles, air defenses. Do you feel that, and we had that the United States Navy is gathering intelligence, I would assume, for Israel. And do you feel that something's coming? We talked about it before, but how do you see the current state of what's going on?
I remember our conversation with Trita Parsi, and I agree with Trita that, in fact, Israel will again attack Iran. My only question is whether they have the capability in place to do that effectively. They're very ingenious, the Israelis, and very duplicitous. They may be able to do something. I think Iran is clearly preparing itself for just such a contingency. And I agree with Trita also that if there is another exchange of fire between Israel and Iran will not hold back as it did in the last 3 rounds. It will attack infrastructure targets. It will attack civilian targets, which it tried very hard not to in the previous rounds. It will try to do the maximum damage to Israel that it can. And I think it has the capability to do that, whether the United States is there or not. Just what the aircraft carrier Nimitz was up to when it entered the Persian Gulf and visited Bahrain, which is the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet for the United States, I don't know. But you can be damn sure that intelligence and reconnaissance of Iran is ongoing. And if you remember a few years ago, in the first Trump administration, Iran shot down a drone that was collecting intelligence. And Trump, much to the surprise of our Arab friends, brushed off the incident and did not respond. So I think the Iranian Navy is apparently at sea. It is not at Bandar Abbas anymore. And I think the Iranians are, in fact, still on a war footing. So, yes, it's very dangerous. And I don't think Iran will attack Israel, but it will counterattack very forcefully if Israel attacks it.
Yeah. Netanyahu had an interview just 2 days ago, if I'm not mistaken, and he mentioned that the enemy of Israel, the enemies of Israel are somehow increasing. And he was talking about mainstream media, even the algorithms and these everything is going against Israel. Even he talked about Gen Z being somehow brainwashed by the media and they're totally against Israel. Let me, before going to that, let me play it for you what he said about the the Gen Z. Yeah, here is what he said.
Like the European leaders, who doesn't succumb to this stuff. But if you're telling me that there's work to be done on Gen Z and across the West, yes. And by the way, it's not only our job.
Yeah, everybody should help them to somehow.
to propagate their lies. Here he is. We have the UN. We have a coalition of international humanitarian groups all saying that there are 130,000 children in Gaza who are in danger of starving to death within a week. Within a week. And he says there's no starvation in Gaza. This is all Hamas propaganda. I think he has forgotten a basic truth, which is that if you want to be hated, all you have to do is hateful things. And Israel is doing so many odious, hateful things that, of course, very few people in the world have any regard for it anymore. And only those with tribal loyalties through Zionism to Israel are prepared to defend it. And even they now shrink from attempting to defend it because what it is doing is absolutely indefensible. So the notion somehow this is there's always, I can remember from the civil rights struggle in the United States, the classic response of those conducting the oppression was the protests are all against this, are all mistaken. They're all produced by outside agitators. There's nothing to see here. Please go away. Netanyahu claims that starvation in Gaza is because Hamas is stealing food. That is absolutely incredible, and nobody believes it. So the question is, to paraphrase Groucho Marx, who are you going to believe, Netanyahu or your lying eyes? We can see what's going on. And every time Netanyahu denies it, he further discredits the country he leads. And he further damages the interests of Jews all over the world because to the extent that they are perceived as accepting his pretensions to speak for them, they invoke anti-Semitism.
Yeah, it was amazing for me to see Bernie Sanders talking about it he had an interview on CNN with Dana Bash. She asked him if Hamas is responsible for the starvation he said no, it's all about Israel and their actions. Do you feel that somehow the reality is hitting them? Because Bernie Sanders was criticizing Israel, but somehow cautiously.
Well, he's a politician, a very good one. He's also Jewish, and I commend him for being honest on many issues. Dana Bash is also Jewish, I believe. So this is a conversation between two Jews. I think Dana Bash is part of the apparatus that tries to conceal what is happening, deny it, excuse it. Bernie Sanders is on the other side, and I admire him for that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today.
Well,
great pleasure as always.
I'm not sure it was a pleasure, but I was happy to be with you.
It's always a pleasure.